The Last Blood Moon.
The Carpathian night was unnaturally still, as if the earth itself dared not breathe. Overhead, the heavens churned with rust-colored clouds, swirling in anticipation of the eclipse foretold by forgotten tongues. Tonight marked the return of the blood moon, an omen that had last stained the sky when Vlad Dracula first drank from the chalice of immortality. But now, after centuries of terror, the crimson moon rose not to honor his reign, but to signal its end. Dracula stood alone at the highest tower of Castle Bran, its black stones damp with centuries of mist and memory. His once proud silhouette had thinned, his crimson-lined cloak draped over a gaunt frame. The winds, once silenced by his mere presence, now howled through the empty corridors of his decaying fortress. Beneath his pale skin, the blood he had hardied began to sour, turning cold, thick, resisting him like curdled wine. Something ancient and foul stirred within him. Not pain, not weakness, but something far worse, mortality. The eclipse began, a slow encroachment of shadow that devoured the moon's glow. As the last sliver of white vanished, the moon turned to blood and the earth beneath Dracula's feet trembled. He staggered, not from any blade, nor divine curse, but from within. His heart, which had not beaten in 500 years, pulsed once, then again, a sickening, heavy thud. He fell to his knees, clawing at his chest. The blood, his precious reservoir, spilled from his mouth in thick, black torrents. It painted the stone floor in obscene sigils. He tasted death for the first time since he had defied it. Below, wolves howled and birds scattered. Far off, the bells of some distant chapel rang without hands. The world was shifting. Inside the crypts of his castle, coffins cracked open. His brides, reduced to cobwebs and ash, dissolved entirely. The very earth beneath the foundation groaned with the weight of his sins. Gargoyles wept crimson tears. The walls oozed black ichor. His portrait in the great hall withered into rot, its canvas curling away from his painted eyes. Dracula knew this was no divine punishment. It was something older, darker. Something that had waited patiently, buried deep in the threads of fate and time. He forced himself to stand. His reflection flickered in a broken shard of mirror, thing he had not seen in centuries. It showed a man ravaged by time, by hunger, by his own myth. His fangs, once ivory daggers, had dulled. His eyes, once infernal beacons, now dimmed to embers. Still, he was no mere man. Not yet. Dracula turned from the moonlight, its crimson rays carving lines of fire into his skin. He descended the tower with heavy steps, dragging his cloak like a shroud. Each stair he crossed bled behind him. The castle drank his pain. Its stones pulsed with it. In the great hall, he stood before his ancient throne, the walls still howling beyond the ruin-stained glass. The eclipse above reached its zenith, bathing the land in a final blood wash. His time was unraveling, thread by thread. And yet, something still stirred in the dark. A whisper from the earth, a name spoken by none. A curse not yet fulfilled. The last blood moon was only the beginning.
The Scholar's Obsession.
The candle burned low, its flame shivering against the chill that no hearth could banish. Dust thickened the air like ash in a ruined cathedral. In a forgotten monastery-turned archive deep in the Carpathians, a man leaned over parchment older than kingdoms. His name was Gregor Vass, once a priest, once a vampire hunter, and now little more than a ghost among ink and bone. Gregor's hands, ink-stained and trembling, hovered over a page bound in human skin. The text pulsed with an unnatural warmth, each letter etched in blood that had never dried. He had read it 1,000 times, each time deeper, darker. This time, it spoke to him differently, as if the words had waited until the blood moon to open their true mouth. He whispered the phrase he now believed to be a prophecy: when the moon weeps blood, and the immortal drinks his own decay, the true death will walk in shadow. It wasn't just metaphor. It was a map. The signs were undeniable. The skies had turned. The eclipse had come and gone, but its taint remained. Birds fell dead in flight, rivers darkened for a day, and travellers spoke of a keening wind from the east that made their teeth bleed. All of it pointed to one truth: Dracula, the Lord of Night, was dying. Gregor's obsession had begun as vengeance. His sister had been taken to decades ago, dragged from her convent bed, and turned into a shrieking wraith under the prince's thrall. He had hunted her for 10 years, until he found her feeding in a crypt, laughing with a mouthful of blood. He had driven the stake himself. That night, something inside him broke, but something else began to burn. He devoted himself to history, to scripture, to all records left behind by mad monks and dying hunters. In his madness, he found revelation. He traced the lineage of those who had faced Dracula and failed. Knights, monks, witches, executioners. All of them had left fragments, clues like shattered bones, leading to something whole. Each page of his collection spoke not of triumph, but of a second death, one deeper than any stake or flame could offer. Dracula's curse, it seemed, could be undone not by blade, but by truth, a ritual buried in time and sealed in blood. And now the final piece had come. He retrieved a scroll sealed in wax, one he had taken from a murdered gypsy queen in Bulgaria. The seal cracked like old bones. Inside, a drawing, a man impaled upon a black sun. And beneath it, in dead tongues, he who holds the name of the dead king can unmake the crown. Gregor understood. Dracula's name, his true name, had power. Vlad Tepes was but the mask. The name beneath, the one whispered only to the night, was the key. And that name, Gregor believed, lay buried in the ruins of a monastery scorched in 1490, near the village of Kharka, now swallowed by forest and myth. Blood began to seep from Gregor's nose, unnoticed. The manuscript before him had grown warm, the blood ink shimmered. A tremor crawled up his spine. Something was watching. Something old, something hungry. He forced himself to his feet, swaying as if drunk on centuries. There was no time left for caution. Dracula's death had begun, but it would not complete itself. The prophecy demanded a witness, a herald, a scholar mad enough to speak the name that unravels immortality. Gregor packed his blades, his books, and a vial of his own blood, the final component in a rite he scarcely understood. He didn't need to. The words burned in his skull now, branded into memory. The last blood moon had only cracked the coffin. It would be the scholar who opened it. Far away, in Castle Bran, a scream echoed through the stones, not of rage, but of fear. Dracula had felt the name stir.
The hollow coffin.
The castle groaned like a dying leviathan. Ancient stones wept mortar. Beams sagged beneath the weight of centuries, and tapestries that once whispered seduction now fluttered like funeral veils. A cold, suffocating silence pressed down upon Castle Bran, broken only by the distant screech of a starving bat. In the crypt below, the silence shattered. With a sound like wet meat tearing, Dracula gasped back to life. He clawed his way from the coffin, not with the grace of a resurrected god, but with the desperation of something half dead. His nails, blackened and split, scraped against the rotting velvet lining of his sarcophagus. His eyes opened, not glowing but clouded, red-rimmed, and hollow. The blood moon had passed, but its curse lingered in his marrow. He staggered from the coffin, bare feet touching cold stone, and then he paused. Something was wrong. There was no one. No brides draped in shadows, no ghoul attendants, no familiars flitting between the arches. The crypt, once a cathedral of whispers and dripping blood, was silent and bare. Torches had long since extinguished. The air was thick with decay, not the rot of fresh death, but the sterile, arid smell of dust. Dracula turned slowly. His gaze fell back upon the coffin from which he had risen. It was empty, truly empty. No soil, no scent, no remnant of the dark power that had once soaked the casket wood. He reached inside and dragged his hand across the interior, smooth, clean, hollow. This was not sleep. This had been abandonment. Something had stripped the coffin of its sanctity. The ritual sanctuary that once regenerated his flesh had become a tomb with no voice. He opened his palm. No blood came, only flakes of dead skin, falling like ash. Dracula rose, trembling. His strength was fractured, leaking from him with every heartbeat. That word bit at him. His chest, once a silent void, now pulsed faintly, irregularly, as if his body remembered mortality and hungered for it. He staggered through the crypt. Dust coated the sarcophagi of his generals. He pried one open empty, another, and another. The last few crumbled at his touch, their occupants disintegrated into brittle bones and fine powder. The legion he had forged over 600 years was gone. In the great hall, the windows were shattered. Wind poured through them like mocking laughter. The portraits had aged grotesquely, his own image slashed through with claw marks. Above the hearth, where once hung a chalice forged from a saint's skull, there was only black scorch. He reached the altar where his blood had been stored, hundreds of vials collected over centuries, all shattered. The stone floor was slick with what remained, ancient blood, turned to a congealed, black jelly. It stank of vinegar and failure. His knees buckled. He fell to the floor, palms splashing into the cold remains of his legacy. He roared, but it was not the roar of a king. It was the guttural shriek of something realizing it had been left behind. Forgotten by time, betrayed by darkness itself. And far away, as if in response, something whispered, a name, his name. But not Vlad, not Dracula, the true name. The one never spoken since the moment he was turned beneath the cursed tree of Snagorv, under a harvest moon drenched in blood. It echoed from the forest, from some cracked ruin. Gregor now approached, driven by prophecy and madness. Dracula hissed, blood running from his eyes like tears. The name hurt him. It was a wound that could not be closed. A memory dragged from beneath the floorboards of eternity. His time was unraveling. He rose one last time. The hollow coffin had taken his sanctuary. Now he would take the world's blood in return, or die unmade.
The pale air.
The wind carried the stench of rot and burnt stone. It crawled through the Carpathian forest. Trees bent low, their bark blackened with age and superstition. Somewhere beyond the desolate pines, the broken silhouette of Castle Bran loomed, its towers cracked, its spires bleeding shadow. The castle had become a mausoleum, and yet something stirred beneath its roof once more. From the north, a lone figure approached. The rider was draped in grey, his cloak fluttering like torn parchment behind him. His horse, skeletal and foam-mouthed, collapsed at the edge of the withered forest. The rider did not mourn it. He stepped forward silent, pale, and impossibly young. Yet there was something wrong with his face. Something too old behind the cold grey eyes. As if his features were borrowed, worn like a mask. His name was Elian Verduva, and in his veins ran blood that had been cursed before his birth. Dracula felt his approach. The moment Elian's boot touched the first broken stone of the castle's outer stair, the walls of Bran groaned like an animal waking from surgery. Bats shrieked in the belfry, flinging themselves into the night. Somewhere below, a mirror shattered though none had reflected in centuries. Dracula stood in the ruin of the great hall, his pasture skeletal, his robes dragging like burial shrouds. He had fed on vermin and shadows, clawing back fragments of strength. But he was still bleeding power, like a punctured vein. The castle, his anchor to this world, no longer obeyed. The hollow coffin had marked the beginning of his unraveling, and now the air had come. Elian stepped across the blood-slick floor, his presence unnatural. The very air recoiled from him. Dust did not settle on his skin. Light what little bled through the ruined arches bent oddly around his form. Unsure how to touch him, he said no words, his breath misted, though the hall was not cold. Dracula watched him from the shadows, his fangs retracted, his eyes dim. But inside his withered chest, something pulsed, recognition, not familial, primordial. This boy, this thing had his blood, yes, but also something darker, a corruption that did not originate from Dracula's ancient curse. Elian's birth was not natural. He had been conceived beneath a broken altar in Wallachia, by a woman whose soul had long since withered in a sanatorium. A virgin defiled by prophecy, her womb fed on nightmares and scripture. When she bled him into the world, he had not cried, only stared, unblinking, at the red moon above. The midwives died within days, their mouths torn open from within. He was made, not born, and now he had come to Dracula, not to kneel but to replace. The moment crystallized, Dracula stepped from the dark, his shadow clinging to the ceiling like smoke. His voice cracked the silence. "You are nowhere," he rasped. "You are a grave." Elian's eyes did not flinch, and then he smiled. It was not a child's smile. It was the rictus grin of something long dead, trying to imitate the living. Blood trickled from the corners of his lips, as if the smile itself wounded him. The curse in his blood had begun to wake, the stones beneath his feet cracked. Dracula stumbled backward as the castle reacted not to him, but to Elian. Paintings flared in spontaneous fire. The chandeliers burst. The castle remembered its master and recoiled. A curse more ancient than vampirism stirred in the boy's body. Something darker than Dracula's own making. Not undeath, not divinity, nullity. Elian's blood, tainted by forgotten rites, had been bred to undo. A walking contradiction, a pale heir not meant to rule, but to end the line entirely. The final nail in Dracula's legacy. And still, the boy advanced, his veins now glowing faintly beneath the translucent skin. Each step echoed with something unsaid, a heartbeat from a heart that was never human. Dracula, once the monster that made emperors tremble, now felt fear. Not for his death but for what would replace him.
The Wrath of the Vatican.
Beneath the catacombs of Rome, where the air reeked of ancient incense and ossified saints, the walls trembled with whispered Latin and burning intent. The Order of the Black Thorn, an excommunicated sect buried by history and papal decree, had returned. They were not priests, not anymore. They were executioners of the divine, clad in crimson vestments, their eyes hollow from fasting and visions. And in the center of their sanctuary, chained in iron veined with silver, lay the reliquary. Sealed since the Crusades, now open, within it gleamed the instruments of annihilation, the nails of martyrdom, soaked in the blood of St. Barachil, the censer of breathless flame, which burned without air, and at its heart a lance splintered, blackened, pulsing faintly with divine hatred. The lance of mourning, carved from the very tree from which the first vampire had hung in cursed agony. These were not relics for prayer, they were weapons for war. The High Executor, Father Aurelius Varcino, anointed each item with the ash of burned heretics. His eyes bled constantly tears of red, the price he paid for staring too long into the book of silence, the unspoken gospel that predicted this moment, the fall of Vlad Dracula, son of the dragon, prince of rot. Word had reached even the Vatican's hidden libraries. The blood moon had turned, the castle had groaned awake. And now, the pale air had emerged, the final echo in the house of monsters. It was time to erase the echo. They did not march with banners. They rode in silence, 12 crimson priests on hollow-eyed horses, hooves blackened by sacred oil. They crossed nations as ghosts, their presence wilting crops, cracking church bells, and waking the long-buried. Wherever they passed, dogs whimpered and birds fell dead from the sky. On the 7th night, as frost clawed the windows of every chapel between Vienna and the Carpathians, they reached the edge of the forest. Castle Bran glared from the mountaintop, its towers crooked like broken teeth. Lightning cracked above it, but did not touch it. Storms circled the castle, afraid to descend. The land itself seemed diseased, yet the priests moved forward. They cut their palms and dripped blood into the soil. Latin hissed from their tongues, not sung, not prayed, but forced through clenched teeth like venom. The forest parted, groaning, as if the trees themselves feared what would come. Inside the castle, Dracula stirred. He felt them, like knives scraping along his ribs. A holy heat that made his teeth rattle in their sockets. The relics he had felt them once before, during the siege of Venice, when half his coven burned in sacred fire and his own right arm had nearly withered to ash. But this time, he was weaker. The pale air lingered still, silent and watching, and Dracula dared not strike him down. Something in the boy unmade him with mere presence. And now, he rose, slow as a corpse through syrup blood, and dragged himself to the altar. The stone beneath him pulse cracked from the boy's arrival. Dust fell from the ceiling like funeral ash. The Vatican had not come for confession. They had come to end God's mistake. At the gates, Father Varcino raised the lance of mourning. It vibrated in his grasp, whispering curses in a forgotten tongue. His brethren surrounded him, each wielding sacred tools, chalices filled with sunlight, crucifixes forged from some bones, blades that had kissed the hearts of martyrs. Then they entered. The castle screamed. Walls bled, doorways collapsed, portraits caught fire. The very shadows recoiled from the priests as if infected. With every relic step, the air thickened, congealing into a choking miasma. Dracula stood atop the staircase, his cape torn, his form flickering like a dying flame. Eyes sunken, blood bubbling from his mouth. His immortality was already fraying his skin, splitting where the relics neared. But he did not beg. He bared his fangs and roared. The first priest to cross the threshold burst into flame. The others pressed on, unflinching. They had been trained in fire, born in it. As the high executor raised the lance and drove it forward, it cut not just through air, but through time, piercing the space where legends die and gods go silent. And in that moment, Dracula bled like a man.
The bride's betrayal.
The castle still smouldered from the Vatican's assault. Its walls wept molten stone, hallways flickered with ghost fire. The cruciform wounds carved into Dracula's flesh had yet to close, seared open by the lance of mourning, driven not deep enough to kill, but far enough to humiliate. The priests had retreated, for now. Perhaps they believed the cursed prince would not last the night. They were wrong. Dracula lived, barely. He clung to the altar like a dying beast, his once majestic robes reduced to ribbons, soaked in his own tainted blood. His breath came in ragged, wet gasps. His eyes, once crimson moons, were now dull garnets buried in shadow. The castle groaned. The pale air lingered still, high above in the spire, silent as ever, watching, waiting. And though Dracula had no strength left to summon rage, he felt it simmer, coiling, growing, souring into paranoia. But it was not the boy who came to him next, it was her. She glided through the ruined corridor barefoot, her gown black as dried blood, her veil trailing like smoke. Lilith, the last of his true brides, first turned beneath the Hungarian moon. The only one who had fed at his throat, not the other way around. She had survived wars, purges, sun priests, and silver bullets. She had loved him longer than any mortal had loved anything, and she had betrayed him. He didn't yet know it, but the scent of it clung to her like perfume. She knelt beside him without a word. With delicate fingers, she dabbed his bleeding mouth, kissed his temple, laid his head across her lap. And as she began to hum a song long extinct, Dracula felt something cold in her touch, something final. She spoke, softly, like a lullaby recited at a grave. "Your reign has been long, my love, and selfish." He opened his eyes. He saw not her face, but death, wearing her skin. Lilith's fingers closed around a dagger, made from cursed silver and hardened moonlight. A dagger that had once belonged to the Vatican and had been stolen centuries ago, by a traitor hidden in plain sight. By her, he tried to move, to summon shadow, but nothing answered. The blood relics had undone his magic. His strength had bled out through the holes the priests had carved into him. Lilith smiled, the way a mother might smile at a weeping child. I loved you, even when I knew what you truly were. Then she plunged a dagger through his ribcage. The castle screamed. Blood burst from his chest like a geyser, thick as tar, black as oblivion. His howl shattered the stained glass windows. Ravens took flight from every crumbling turret. Beneath the stone, rats fled their warrens in frantic tides. And Lilith, unfazed, drove the dagger deeper, not to kill, not yet, but to bind him, to paralyze his soul, to make him feel every betrayal, every century of deception, every drop of stolen blood now souring in his veins. Because Lilith had conspired with the Vatican, because Lilith had whispered secrets into the ears of vampire hunters, because Lilith had fed the prophecy to the scholar, the very one who had unearthed the relics, she had orchestrated all of it. Dracula's mouth foamed with gore as he tried to speak her name, but only a wet rasp came. She stroked his face, calm as a widow before a noose. I waited for the blood moon, she whispered. Waited for you to grow weak, you, who called yourself eternal. The dagger pulsed in his chest, his blood boiled, his body spasmed. But death would not come, not yet. She would not let him die so easily, not until the pact was broken, not until the pale air chose a side. Lilith rose, leaving him writhing upon the altar like a slaughtered god, and vanished into the darkness. Behind her, the flames began to climb again. The castle groaned deeper, as if waking for a second time. And somewhere in the shadows, the air watched, silent, still, unmoved, but not for long.
The Shadow Hunt.
Night fell like a blade over Transylvania, not with peace, but with purpose. The woods that once whispered secrets now held them, their trees arching like witnesses to an ancient reckoning. Blood had been spilled in the castle, betrayal sealed in silver and fire. Now, the shadows stirred, hungering for justice or vengeance. From the northern wilds, they came on padded feet and gritted fangs. Werewolves, bound by blood oaths older than empires, emerged in droves beneath the moon already tinged in rust. They were no longer scattered beasts, but a united force, drawn to the weakening pulse of the one who had cursed their kind centuries ago. Their claws had been forged into weapons by priests, their minds sharpened by hunters. From the south, the vampire slayers arrived hooded in black, riding steeds foaming with sweat, bearing relics that hissed in the presence of old magic. Crossbows carved from elderwood, bolts soaked in relic oil and ash. Each one carried a name etched into their blade, a name lost to Dracula's thirst. Sons, daughters, lovers, ghosts the vampire king had never known, now carried as curses into battle. At the heart of the storm, Dracula's castle bled smoke into the sky. The air reeked of sulphur and ancient rot. Its towers had collapsed like dying lungs. Its once holy chapel twisted into a desecrated tomb, where Dracula's body pierced and cursed still writhed in torment. The silver dagger planted by Lilith throbbed like a second heart inside his chest. He could feel his castle mourning him, whispering secrets to the stone. The pale air watched it all unfold from the spire, untouched by wind or fear. The boy's eyes glimmered not with horror, but calculation. The time to choose had come, but before the air could descend, the siege began. The werewolves struck first, howling as one, tearing through the outer walls with claws made to shred vampire flesh. Their alpha, a beast twice the size of any man, hurled himself through the charred gates with a roar that made the dead tremble. His pack followed like an avalanche of fur and fury, swarming over the crumbling stones. The vampire hunters did not wait. They circled the castle, sealing every exit with glyphs scrawled in consecrated blood. Then they moved in, crossbows crackling with silver charge, eyes narrowed beneath veils of hate. Inside the castle, the few undead that remained tried to rise, former nobles and thralls crawling from crypts, drawn by the scent of blood and war. But they were nothing now, weak, scattered, hungry. They died screaming as werewolf jaws snapped their spines and stakes found their hearts like magnets. Blood coated the marble floors. It ran down staircases in rivulets. The screams both beast and man twisted together in a symphony of carnage. Limbs were torn, heads flung like trophies. The very stones of the castle drank the massacre eagerly, and still, Dracula did not rise. Bound to the altar by betrayal and relic, he could only feel the dying. Every drop spilled fed the dagger's curse. Every ally lost drove another splinter into his soul. Lilith was nowhere to be found. Cowardice or cunning, no one knew. But the pale air moved, silent, graceful, descending like dusk. He passed corpses and flame, crossblades, and beasts, yet none touched him. Whether by magic or fear, they parted before him like reeds before the tide. And in the sanctuary where Dracula bled, the air knelt. He looked at the broken king not with pity, but hunger. Outside, the werewolves broke into the inner sanctum, the vampire hunters lit the final flame, and the castle began to scream again. The shadow hunt had begun with a promise, no more dark kings. But as the pale air rose with blood in his eyes and the dagger in his hand, it was clear this hunt was not an ending, it was a succession.
The Castle of Screams.
The castle no longer slept, it breathed. The ancient stones, long soaked in centuries of blood, had begun to whisper not with wind, but with memory. Groans of tormented souls echoed through the halls, voices poured from the countless thousands who had died within its embrace. Some begged, some cursed, some screamed, but all remembered. Dracula, weakened and bound in the crypt sanctum, heard every voice. Each cry was a wound reopened. Every whisper, a sin recounted in a tongue older than guilt. The walls wept ichor. The air itself grew thick with ash, not of fire, but of crumbled centuries, time itself falling apart. Above, the siege had quieted. The werewolves, those ravening beasts of vengeance, had been slaughtered in the sanctum by glyphs too ancient for their flesh to resist. The hunters who followed were devoured by madness before they reached the throne room, each one driven to suicide or savagery by the whispers, bleeding from the stone. The pale air walked alone through the haunted corridors, his bare feet painting runes in the blood of friend and foe. The castle welcomed him, it once did his ancestor, opening doors that had been sealed since Vlad first tasted immortality. But it did not speak to him as it did Dracula. To him, the castle remained silent, judging, waiting. Deep beneath the shattered bell tower, Dracula stirred. His body had begun to decay from within. The dagger still lodged in his chest, pulsed like a second heart, cold, relentless. His skin was parchment stretched to thin over bone, black veins snaking beneath like roots, through scorched earth. One eye was gone. His once sable hair had turned to brittle snow. Yet he clung to what remained of his soul. Not from fear of death, but from defiance. But the castle did not forgive. The floor beneath him writhed. Bones long hidden behind flagstones broke through like pale flowers in bloom. They danced, puppeted by unseen hands, rattling in laughter or rage. The very walls groaned, reshaping themselves. Staircases twisted, doors vanished, windows screamed. Dracula was no longer master here. He was a prisoner. In a forgotten hall, once used for executions, a crucifix wept black tears. In the kitchens, the ovens baked nothing but ash. In the library, pages turned themselves, blood leaking between the words, and then the castle screamed. It was not a cry of pain, but judgment. The voices of every soul Dracula had consumed, betrayed, or broken were now one. They howled through the mortar, their agony shaking the foundations. Bricks cracked, towers moaned, gargoyles bled. And in the heart of it all, the pale air entered the sanctum. He found the once great count on his knees before an altar built from his own shattered throne. Dracula raised his head, his mouth full of dust, his voice was a rasp. But the air did not answer. He knelt and drove the dagger deeper. The castle wailed as if stabbed itself. Blood burst from the walls, flooding the chamber. The bones in the floor shattered, candles exploded into flame. Dracula's scream was the last to be heard, high, regal, and full of spite. And then silence, the stones stilled. The voices faded, but the castle remembered. It would never forget, nor would it sleep.
The blood of St. George.
The blade had been forgotten by history. Buried beneath a collapsed chapel in the Rhodope Mountains, it slept in stone for centuries untouched, unspoken, unwilling to reveal itself to hands unworthy, until the ground, stirred by the tremors of Dracula's dying wrath, cracked open like a wound, and the relic sang, the sword of St. George, forged in the crucible of martyrdom, tempered in dragon's blood, and sanctified by the screams of the first vampire's fall. It was no mere weapon. It was judgment. The Vatican had searched for it. The werewolves had dreamed of it. Even the pale air, though cursed by blood, feared the prophecy it carried, but it was not found by any of them. It was the scholar Lucien Valin who unearthed it, guided not by divine faith or vengeance, but obsession. His hands bled as he tore through earth and ruin. The sword burned his flesh as he lifted it, branding his soul with a sigil no priest could read. He wept, not from pain, but awe. For in that moment, he felt every death Dracula had ever caused, each life siphoned, every innocence devoured. The blade was heavy not with iron, but grief. Far away, in the heart of the Carpathians, Castle Dracula pulsed like a living organ. Though Dracula had been pierced and his sanctum flooded in blood, he was not dead, not truly. The castle had swallowed him, sealing his ruined body in a black cyst of stone and silence, feeding on its master's remaining power like a leech upon a god. His form was no longer human, nor beast, only bone and shadow, hate and hunger. But he dreamed, and in his dream he still ruled. He saw Lucien coming, felt the sword wake, heard its scream echo through the cursed soil. And he remembered St. George the knight who first wounded the darkness, the man whose blood now anointed the weapon forged for Dracula's end. The pale air stood watch on the outer walls, silent and pale, unsure of his role in the unraveling tale. Was he saviour, usurper, sacrifice? Even he could not say. The scholar arrived beneath a red sky, alone, his flesh blistered from the blade's fire, his eyes hollowed by knowledge no man should carry. The ground hissed beneath his steps. The gate of the castle did not open, it shattered. Screaming in protest, he entered. The castle groaned. The sword, as if drawn by the castle's wicked memory, ignited in white flame. Its heat peeled the shadows from the walls. The screams returned, louder now, vengeful, desperate, eternal. Down he walked, deeper than any mortal should tread, past corpses still twitching, past brides turned to ash, past mirrors cracked by lies, until he stood before the black cyst. It pulsed once, split, and Dracula emerged no longer regal, no longer even a thing of beauty. He was rot-made flesh, crowned in bone, wrapped in the robes of his sins. His eyes were embers, his mouth a wound, and still, even ruined, he terrified. Lucien raised the sword, the castle wailed, Dracula lunged, and with a single cry, a wordless scream torn from generations of torment, Lucien drove the blade into the vampire's heart. The sound was not thunder, it was memory-shattering. Blood erupted not red, but gold and black, ancient and thick, like the oil of uncreation. It drowned the crypt, it set the walls ablaze. Dracula roared once, but it broke into sobs, rage and sorrow intermingled. His hands crumbled first, then his eyes, then his teeth. The last part to die was his shadow, and even it resisted. When the flames died, Lucien was gone. Only the sword remained, standing upright in a pool of blackened blood, still aflame, humming softly. Above, the castle stilled, the stones no longer screamed. But the pale air, watching from a broken spire, knew this was not the end. Not truly. There was still a pact to be made. Still a crown unclaimed.
The deathless pact.
There is a silence beyond death, a hush older than creation where no blood flows, no heart beats, and even time forgets to breathe. It was here that Dracula fell, but he did not fall alone. As the cursed blood of St. George seared through his heart, burning away centuries of dominion and defiance, Dracula's soul was torn loose-ripped from its throne of flesh and shadow. And as the castle crumbled, and his body turned to ruin, his essence was flung into that grey, yawning abyss. A place where the damned crawl, and the forgotten scream. He awoke not with sight, but with memory. The fog of the void clung to him, thick with voices his own victims, endless and vengeful, children he drained in their sleep, queens he seduced into madness, warriors who had dared to resist. They circled him now, whispering his name, a curse etched into eternity. But then the whisper ceased, and something ancient stirred. It did not speak, it did not move, yet its presence bent the void into silence. Death had arrived not as a reaper, but as a force, vast, infinite, hungering. Dracula had escaped it 4 lifetimes, outwitted it, mocked it. He had danced on the graves of kings and fed on plagues, but here he was small again, mortal. Yet he did not beg. Instead, Dracula offered a deal. Not a plea for mercy, but a pact in defiance of oblivion. In the quiet of the abyss, he poured out his final gambit, a successor, bound by blood and legacy, chosen not from strength but from curse. The pale heir, half-blood, unfinished, unproven, but untouched by the old laws. Someone who could walk where he could not, twist fate from within, the void considered. It tasted Dracula's offer, like a butcher weighing spoiled meat. Then came the price, not his soul, no, that had been spent long ago, but his name, his legacy, his memory. To ensure the pact, Dracula would become unmade, not simply destroyed but forgotten. Erased from every scroll, every scripture, every terrified bedtime story, the world would forget his evil, his dread, his victories, even his cruelty. There would be no more Dracula, only ash. And from that ash, something else would rise, he agreed. The pact was sealed with pain that no tongue could describe. A scream that echoed backward through time, unraveling portraits, erasing bloodlines, dissolving echoes. In that moment, even the moon turned away, far above. In the shattered remnants of Castle Dracula, the pale heir fell to his knees. He did not know why the air tasted of rust and fire, why the wind hissed with finality. But he felt the severing. Dracula was gone, truly gone. But the pact had left a wound. A mark now burned beneath the heir's skin, ancient, writhing, alive. A brand that pulsed with the memories of 1,000 murders, 1,000 crowns. He rose, trembling. The sword of St. George remained, buried in scorched stone. Yet its flame had dimmed. The world had lost its monster. But in the death of terror, something worse had been born. Unremembered evil, nameless hunger, a successor with no past and nothing to lose.
The crowning of the new king.
The fire still smouldered in the ruins of Castle Dracula. Ash drifted like snow over the blood-wet stones, and the moon, a withered sliver, now hung low, shrouded in haze. The echoes of war had faded. The priests were dead, the werewolves scattered. The old king was gone, devoured by the void in a pact sealed with eternal forgetting. But something remained, something darker. The pale heir stood alone atop the broken days of the throne room, where once Dracula's obsidian seat had loomed like a monolith. That seat now lay shattered, as if the castle itself had rejected it. Yet from beneath the rubble, something pulsed. A slow, living heartbeat, not of flesh, but of shadow. An inheritance not carved in lineage, but pain. He had not wanted this. When he first crossed the threshold of the ruined castle in Chapter 4, he had sought only answers, not coronation. He had carried the curse in his veins, half human, half forgotten. But now the curse stirred, awakened fully by the pact. The mark seared on his chest pulsed with heat and memory. 1,000 voices, Dracula's victims, his brides, his betrayers, whispered through his blood. And still deeper, beneath them all, another presence watched, silent, ancient. Proud, the air screamed, not from pain, but from transformation. Bones cracked, lengthened, his pupils split, slivered. Fangs erupted through still healing gums, veins turned black with memory and power. His humanity burned away like parchment in flame, until only the curse remained refined, perfected. The castle groaned as though it to sense the change. Then the stones bled. Walls split open in weeping cracks, leaking black ichor and whispers. A choir of the dead sang through the corridors low, wordless, mourning and triumphant all at once. It was not merely coronation. It was resurrection. The air turned toward the altar where the relics of the Vatican still lay smouldering, shattered by the castle's collapse. He stepped forward, dragging behind him a trailing robe of coagulated shadow spontaneously spun from the air itself. Where he walked, frost formed. The very flame recoiled. Then, as if called by his breath, the crows returned, not birds, but watchers. Pale-eyed, bone-winged things that circled overhead, screeching their allegiance. They nested in the ruined buttresses, in the eye sockets of old gargoyles. One landed on his shoulder, cawed once and died instantly, consumed in a flare of dark flame. Still, the others did not flee. The air reached into the altar ruins and drew forth a crown, a relic not of gold or gem, but of bone, rusted nail, and mummified thorn. Dracula's crown. It had survived only because it had been forgotten like its maker. But now, with the pact fulfilled, it remembered its purpose. He placed it upon his brow. The howl that followed cracked the remaining stained glass, rippling out across the Carpathians like a new plague. Wolves died mid-run, priests wept blood in their sleep. Somewhere, a child dreamed of fangs in the cradle. A new king had been crowned. But unlike Dracula, who had ruled with seduction and dread, this king would know no memory, no love, no myth. His name had not yet been spoken, and that made him more dangerous than Dracula had ever been. He was not a relic of ancient sin. He was now, born not from legacy but void. The castle pulsed around him, beginning to rebuild not with stone, but with bone and shadow, forming towers that writhed like living things. And from the dark, new children began to crawl. Not vampires, not humans, something else. The pale air no longer pale, but crowned in shadow spread his arms as the night deepened. And the world, sensing its new king, began to bleed.
The Last Feast.
The banquet hall had not seen life in centuries, and yet tonight it breathed again, not with warmth or joy, but with rot and blood. Moonlight, filtered through torn velvet and frostbitten glass, barely reached the long, dust-caked table. It was now set grotesquely with goblets carved from skulls, platters of blackened flesh, and candles that burned with an unnatural crimson flame. The scent of iron hung heavy in the air, and seated along the length of the table were monsters, Dracula's final children. Some had not stirred in 100 years, their minds lost to the hunger. Others had clawed their way back from the ashes of forgotten crypts, summoned by a wordless call. A few still bore the wounds from the siege, the silver burns, the holy scars. None dared speak. At the head of the table sat Dracula himself, ragged, regal, ruinous. He had returned. Not whole, not strong, but they're drawn back from the edge of oblivion by the one clause in the pact. He had never told death, the right to host one final gathering before surrender. He wore the same cloak he had been entombed in Mortheaton, soaked with grave mud, but clasped at the throat with the bloodstone of the first turning. His crown was gone, usurped by the pale air, his empire in ruins, and yet still they looked to him. One last time, with a wave of his trembling hand, the feast began. Goblets rose, flesh was torn, the feeding began in silence. No laughter, no revelry, only the low hiss of ancient throats draining their fill. The walls groaned around them, alive with the whispering voices of the damned, murmuring memories of better nights, darker nights. Then, from behind the throne, emerged the traitors. The bride ageless, beautiful, stained with the sin of her betrayal. The scholar aged now, his eyes hollowed from too much forbidden knowledge. And the pale heir no longer an heir, but a godling, cloaked in midnight, with eyes like eclipsed suns. His steps did not echo. His presence silenced the feast. Dracula stood, slowly. What little power he had left crackled at his fingertips, a pathetic flicker of the infernos he once conjured. His voice, dry and cracked, filled the hall like a final sermon. You would strike me down at my table. But they already had. The blood on the table was tainted. The goblets laced with sunstone ash, blessed salt, monk's bane. His children began to seize, one after another, foam at the mouth, convulse, ignite. Screams rose like a dirge. Dracula turned, reaching toward his bride, but her eyes held no love. Only centuries of vengeance. The pale heir stepped forward not with hate, but with purpose. He drove the blade of St. George through Dracula's side. No scream came, only a hiss, like a dying wind. The blade drank deep not just blood, but time. It fed on centuries. Dracula's skin withered, flaked, dissolved into drifting parchment. His bones cracked inward, pulled by the weight of his stolen life, eyes sunk, fingernails blackened. The great lord of the night was being unmade. Dracula fell to his knees. The throne room around him collapsed in a slow, deliberate decay. Stones wept, gargoyles split. The very castle, once bound to his will, mourned its dying master. As his last breath left his withered body, a final tremor shook the earth. But he did not beg, he smiled, for in death he left behind no corpse. Only a stain, a story, a curse without a master. The pale heir turned, the crown now fused to his flesh, the hall behind him crumbling into silence. The last feast was over. The old king gone, but the hunger would endure.
The ashes of immortality.
Dracula was dead, or so the world believed. What remained of him, what little the blade of St. George had not consumed, lay scattered across the cracked marble floor of the ruined banquet hall. A smear of blackened bone, a crown half melted, a curl of scorched velvet clinging to nothing. His final scream had not echoed. It had sunk, like a stone thrown into a bottomless well. But death is never simple for the undying. The ashes did not cool, they burned, a quiet, emberless fire gnawed at what was left of the vampire king. Not flames of hell, nor holy judgment, but time itself reclaiming its due. Every stolen century, every drop of blood taken in greed, now cried out from within his remains. And the castle felt it, the stones wept crimson. Walls cracked open with deep, agonized groans. Shadows once Dracula's loyal veil began to twist and flee from the light bleeding in through broken stained glass. His throne, long a symbol of fear, split down the middle like a cleaved skull, yet something lingered. In the black dust where his heart had been, a pulsing glow throbbed soft at first, then stronger, like a dying star refusing collapse. The ashes stirred, they fought back. For within Dracula had always lived a truth no scholar ever uncovered. Immortality was never a gift. It was a debt. Every soul he consumed, every age he defied, had layered his essence like a vault of sins. Now, with no vessel to contain it, the vault cracked, and something began to scream from within. The remnants of his children, those not consumed by the poison feast, staggered through the wreckage, drawn by that infernal pull. One by one, they collapsed around the ashes, weeping blood, howling as the air thickened into a choking mist of memory and fire. Some tried to crawl away, none succeeded. Dracula's dying magic took them not out of cruelty, but necessity. The ashes demanded restitution. In the shadows above, the pale heir watched in silence, the crown fused to his flesh, now bleeding at the edges. His reign had begun with murder, but he had not expected the cost. The death of Dracula did not end the curse, it unleashed it. Then the air fractured. A ripple of energy burst from the center of the room, silent, invisible, but felt by every living thing within miles. Birds fell from the sky. Forests quieted. The blood in every living creature's veins ran colder, thinner. It was as if the world had suddenly remembered something ancient and terrible. The ashes rose. Not into a shape, not a resurrection, but into torment. Faces flickered through the smoke. The slain, the betrayed, the forgotten. Ghosts of victims long erased, howling as they passed through centuries of pain in seconds. The hall became a mausoleum of screaming memory. And at the center of it all, still pulsing, was Dracula's soul, no longer bound to flesh, no longer regal or proud, just a whisper of ruin. The pale air stepped forward, blade drawn, but the ashes did not threaten him. They recognized him. He was not merely the next king. He was the final sentence. And yet, as the last speck of Dracula's essence dissolved into the cold dawnlight, it left behind one thing, a scar in the stone. A mark carved not by hand, but by will, a single symbol. Not a name, not a warning, a promise. Immortality does not die, it waits.
The dawn that never comes.
Night should have ended, the stars had faded, and the horizon should have bled gold, but no light came. The sun, devoured by a permanent eclipse, hovered behind a veil of blood-red cloud, casting the world in a deathless twilight. Time stuttered, day refused to rise, and even hope seemed to rot in its sleep. Dracula was no more, but the wound he left in the world gaped wider with each breath of his successor. The pale air stood atop the highest spire of the shattered castle, wearing the ashes of the old king like a second skin. His eyes, once human, were now hollow pits of ancient flame. Around him, the loyal dead stirred, the blood brides who had not perished in the feast, revenants risen from centuries of sealed tombs, the last of the vampire lords too proud to flee. He had summoned them all, not for allegiance, for judgment. Where Dracula ruled with terror, the air ruled with silence. And the silence bled through the land. Below the mountain, cities had already begun to crumble. Crops failed, rivers turned to stagnant pools of black. Children born under this cursed sky emerged cold, their cries unnatural, their eyes old. The curse of Dracula, once contained by his form, now bled unchecked into the soil of the world. He had died, but he had not been defeated. The pale air descended into the throne chamber, now little more than a mausoleum. There, the final battle had already begun. The last knight of St. George, wielding the blessed sword, stood surrounded by the corpses of his brothers. He did not tremble. His wounds poured freely, a crimson river soaking the broken tiles. He had come not to kill, but to witness, to mark the end. When he lunged, the pale air did not move. The blade passed through him like smoke. With a touch, the knight's body twisted in on itself, blood erupting in fine mist. No scream escaped him, his soul had already fled. The throne claimed the air then, not as a seat, but as a curse. Its arms reached out, black stone fingers curling over his limbs. The ashes of Dracula surged from the cracks in the earth, wrapping him in flesh and shadow. He did not resist, his coronation had already occurred in blood. And above, the eclipse pulsed, like a heartbeat, like the eye of a god gone blind. Then the darkness moved. From every corner of the castle, from the dead villages below, from the oceans and forests and hollow hills, shadows rose. Some bore fangs, some claws, some wore the faces of men, long forgotten, but all belonged to Dracula's legacy. The curse had called to them, and they came to feed. What followed was not war. It was unmaking. Armies sent to stop the rise were swallowed before they crossed the borders. Holy relics melted in priests' hands. Wolves howled only once before falling silent forever. The world had miscalculated. Dracula was not the monster. He was the cage. And now, the monster had no name, No body, no mercy. In the frozen sky above, dawn waited. But it did not come, and never would again. Because in this new world of the deathless, light was a lie in Dracula's death, a beginning.
The Forgotten Tomb.
Centuries had passed. The world had shifted, crumbled, rebuilt, and forgotten. Kingdoms rose over bones, cities paved themselves atop choked ruins, and stories once whispered by trembling lips vanished into folklore. The sun had long returned, though weaker, paler, as if cautious of ever shining too boldly again. No one remembered the blood eclipse. No one remembered the King of Shadows, or so it was believed. In the remote Carpathians, swallowed by mist and moss, stood a crooked chapel, rotted wood, cracked stone, and a rusted bell that no wind could stir. It was never marked on maps. Animals avoided it. Travelers found excuses to turn back, but today, one came closer. He was a young historian, weary from weeks of travel, drawn by a footnote in a forbidden manuscript. The beast sleeps in the soil of the unnamed. His boots sank into damp earth. Fog clung to his coat like breath on glass. Something unseen pulled him forward. He didn't see the bones that lined the path beneath the leaves. At the chapel's altar, long abandoned, strangled in ivy, he found a sealed stone hatch. A circle carved in iron, a warning in Latin. Let this name die with him. But curiosity, like hunger, does not heed warnings. With effort and sweat, the traveller opened it. Beneath the chapel lay a staircase, descending into silence. No air stirred, no sound dared follow. He lit his lantern and moved downward, heart pounding not in fear, but reverence. The crypt below was impossibly old. Older than the chapel, older than the soil. Etched along the walls were scenes of horror, wolves ripping monks apart, cities submerged in blood, a man impaled by 1,000 spears and smiling still. The traveller paused at one fresco Dracula, crowned in bone, weeping black tears as death turned its back on him. At the chamber's centre stood a solitary sarcophagus, smooth obsidian, no name, just a sigil scorched into its lid, a single bat-winged crown, half broken. Dust coated the tomb, yet the air was heavy with the scent of old blood. The traveller knelt, brushing away the centuries. His fingers trembled as he traced the crack in the lid, tiny, but deep. Something had tried to escape, or tried to return. He felt it before he heard it, a whisper. No louder than the scrape of a leaf, no clearer than a memory. But it curled into his mind like smoke. You found me. He staggered back, lantern crashing, flame snuffed, darkness swallowed the chamber. His breath caught, every hair on his body rose. The whisper came again, closer now. Inside him, my reign ended too soon. He fled, heart pounding like a funeral drum, stumbling up the stairs. Behind him, the crypt seemed to breathe. Roots pulled back, stones shifted, the earth remembered. When he reached the chapel's exit, he dared a glance back. The door to the tomb stood open, but no footsteps followed. The traveller never spoke of what he saw, never wrote another word. But those who met him afterward said his eyes had changed. They spoke of a darkness behind them, ancient and waiting, and in the centuries to come, children near the Carpathians would whisper of a shadow in the fog, of a grave with no name, of a voice that comes when the wind is still, and of the king who died, but never stayed dead.